We've already done our transfer. Where are you? Where's your minions?
They're scared at home with their guards.
I guess they're made nervous by people with firearms.
People they can't control.
People that they can't control, precisely. And I'll have a few words to say about that. First, I'd like to remind you of John Locke's second treatise that he wrote in 1689. Founders thought a lot of John Locke. This is why. The reason why men enter into society is the preservation of their property. And the end why they choose and authorize a legislative is that there may be laws made and rules set as guards and fences to the properties of all the members of the society, to limit the power and moderate the dominion of every part and member of the society. For since it can never be supposed to be the will of the society that the legislative should have the power to destroy that which everyone designs to secure by entering into the society, and for which the people submitted themselves to the legislators of their own making, whenever the legislators endeavor to take away and destroy the property of the people, or to reduce them to slavery under arbitrary power, they put themselves into a state of war with the people, who are thereupon absolved from any further obedience, and are left to the common refuge which God hath provided for all men against force and violence. Whomsoever therefore the legislative shall transgress this fundamental rule of society, and either by ambition, fear, folly, or corruption endeavor to grasp themselves or put into the hands of any other an absolute power over the lives, liberties, and estates of the people, by this breach of trust they forfeit the power the people had put into their hands for contrary ends, and it devolves to the people who have a right to resume their original liberty.
Amen.
It's easy to see why the founders thought a lot of John Locke. Now, my name is Mike Vanderbough. I've got to admit that. I've come here to these wintry grounds from a much warmer great free state of Alabama to stand beside you as I did in December in your resistance to the growing tyranny in this state. And it is a tyranny. There is no other word that applies so well. From I-594, Michael Bloomberg's billionaire-bought demonic bastard child, to the new anti-firearms laws being promulgated by collectivist politicians behind these walls, to the latest diktat about firearms in the House and Senate galleries, it is a tyranny that has a voracious appetite for your traditional liberty, for your property. An appetite that comes with the state-sanctioned threat of violence to your lives if you do not comply. Well, as I noted when I spoke on the steps of the Connecticut State House almost 2 years ago now, it is an established principle of American jurisprudence that an unconstitutional law is void. It has no effect. But I also noted that the tricky part for those of us who wish to maintain our liberties is how to make that point when all of the levers of power in a state, the executive, the legislative, and the courts, are in the hands of people who the founders themselves would call domestic enemies of the Constitution.
Yeah.
And as I don't need to tell you, there are people behind these walls that fit that description.
Wow.
For we are divided today, as the founders were themselves divided from their fellow countrymen, along the stark lines of the answer to the fundamental question: does the government serve the people, or do the people serve the government? It is a simple question. It is the most basic of questions. And the answer is either one or the other. It cannot be both. It cannot be compromised. Who serves whom? That is what we are here today, in some small part, to discover when we pass through those doors. Other speakers will have given details about what led to this seemingly inconsequential argument over whether citizens can bear firearms in the galleries of the House and Senate. They will explain why it is neither silly nor inconsequential. They will tell you how this began last summer with public insults and threats on the part of leadership of the Washington State Legislature. They will explain how this move on the part of these authorities is contrary to law and to past practice of long standing, and how it is an offense to liberty. But I would like to explain why I'm here. Why I continue to stand by the uncompromising firearm owners, the citizens of Washington State. Why indeed I have done the same thing in other states, from Connecticut to Colorado. How do we maintain our liberties when all those levers of power are in the hands of the domestic enemies of the Constitution? Well, I'll tell you. We simply refuse to be complicit in our own victimization.
Amen.
The citizens of Connecticut answered that question with armed civil disobedience. They simply refused to obey the law demanding that they register their semi-automatic rifles, and even, if you can believe the absurdity of it, that they register the standard capacity magazines that those rifles use. And we're talking about literally millions of magazines. They accepted the fact that their own state had just declared them Class D felons. They accepted it, and then they quietly and politely, with their silent non-compliance, told the Connecticut politicians to go straight to hell. Yeah. Over 100,000 citizens of Connecticut have been staring at their state authorities, essentially over the muzzles of those proscribed rifles, and daring the state to come and take them. And the politicians don't know whether to defecate or go blind. Despite their own promises to the citizen disarmament lobbyists that they pandered to, they are not enforcing the law, because they're frightened to death of what might happen to them if they do.
Damn right. It should be.
Of course, the fact that I published the names, home addresses, and phone numbers of the politicians who voted for this intolerable act on my blog, Stimpsy Street Irregulars, may have had something to do with their reluctance. It's a funny thing. Collectivist tyrants like to put people on lists, but they don't like to be on lists when somebody returns the favor. It's a lesson, frankly, that some of the people behind those walls ought to internalize for the good of us all.
Yep.
I like to be on the list.
If you're not willing to be on a list, sir, you're not a breathing free. That's right. And like Connecticut, you Washingtonians have learned that tyranny can be voted in by a majority.
Yeah.
But as I pointed out in my speech on these grounds in December, that doesn't make it right, it doesn't make it constitutional, it doesn't make it any part of the rule of law in a republic that the founders would recognize.
Right.
As I said then, it doesn't matter if a common criminal comes into your home to rob you, kill you, and victimize your family, or if a majority of your neighbors vote to have the same thing done to you. The crime is the same. Indeed, it is worse if a government does it, because official violence is so much more total, overwhelming, and remorseless. Just ask the victims of every collectivist government massacre of the 20th century, from the Turkish genocide of the Armenians 100 years ago, almost to the year, to the planned famines and gulags of Stalin, the Holocaust of Hitler, the Great Leap Forward of Mao, the killing fields of Pol Pot's Cambodia. Governments have butchered hundreds of millions of innocents in their impersonal hatreds, always with the excuse that they have the right to remake humanity, to punish wrong thinking, to remove inconvenient opposition. And they do it all in the name of the law. The law. Almost every evil is excused by the perpetrators by claiming that they are executing the law. The demons in human form in the Middle East today, who crucify children and burn people to death in iron cages, claim to do so in the name of their chosen law. To call murder the law does not excuse it, nor make it anything other than murder. To call tyranny the law does not make it right, nor does it make it any less tyrannical, even if it is voted into existence by a majority or promulgated by so-called democratically elected representatives. But if the crime is the same, the remedy is the same. The founders knew this, both from their study of history and from their own experience. We make much today about our rebellion against King George III, as if the British monarchy was the entire problem. But the fact of the matter was that King George sat at the head of a parliamentary tyranny, one very similar in many respects to what goes on behind these walls today. Kevin Phillips, in his book 1775, A Good Year for Revolution, points out that the British tyranny was first and foremost a parliamentary tyranny. In the aftermath of the Glorious Revolution of 1688, he argues, quote, Parliament was now more absolute than a king had ever quite been under common law. He continues, under Britain's Constitution, the one-time common law rights of Englishmen, in earlier days invocable against royal transgression, no longer applied as against Parliament. Most Americans of the Patriot faction, however, still cherished an older view rooted in the common law, that English liberty could be asserted against any institutional transgressor. A few British lawyers still agreed with the old interpretation. Similarly, in America, many Tories upheld complete parliamentary sovereignty, something the state claimed that. But on the whole, the two peoples separated by the Atlantic held different views of the British Constitution and the extent to which it did or did not still enshrine the common law verities about tyrants and the rights of Englishmen. If the tyrants were in Parliament, even the rights of Englishmen were no longer assured. Now today, as we stand here in the 21st century, we can see that the de facto descendants of those 18th century English parliamentary tyrants today inhabit the Washington State House, as well as other state houses and governor's mansions around the country. They tell us, do what we say, regardless of law, regardless of the common practice enshrined since Washington's statehood, regardless even of common sense. Do what we say, or we will use the violence of the state to bend you to our will. Why do they do this? Because they can. It is as simple as that. They do it because they think that in ordering the people of Washington State to do their will, that you will obey. They do it because they believe that they have the right to do it. Their tyranny, as the founders feared, is of the elected variety, but it is tyranny nonetheless. Why do they do this? They do it also because they are scared. They understand better than anyone, for they look their own appetites in the mirror every morning when they get up. They know who they are and what they are about. And they know they no longer trust the people if they ever did, especially with the means of self-defense against common criminals or against them. They are frightened that you have figured out their game, that you have reasonably concluded that I-594, the additional anti-self-defense laws that they are pushing inside this House, this latest diktat about the House and Senate galleries, all of it. They are frightened because you now understand that this is about their appetites for your liberty, for your property, that indeed this is about their ability to deny your ability to defend your very lives no matter where or when that need may arise. You know, in the light of recent events in Mumbai and Paris, in Australia and Canada, and yes, in Kansas and Fort Hood and New York City, that need can arise anywhere, anytime. And they would rob these legislative powers. In their fear of firearms in our hands, they would rob you of the means to resist the truly evil. This isn't about common sense gun safety as they claim. This is about control. This is about their control of a government monopoly of violence over the people. They don't want to hear any dissent from you in the peanut galleries, so they will silence you. They will silence you if and only if you allow them to do it. So I must ask, will you allow them to silence you?
Hell no!
Will you?
No!
I can hear you. Let's hope they do. They hide behind their privileges, this new parliamentary tyranny, this self-appointed Mandarin class of our so-called betters. They hide behind their alleged purviews and parliamentary privileges. And they expect their designated bully boys of the Washington State Police to make you knuckle under their else. Good luck with that. It is not their precious butts that they put on the line with their unconstitutional diktats. Oh no, never their own. No, they misuse the good men and women of the Washington State Police to do that. For they are at heart cowards, and they know it. They are right to be right about that one thing. Firearms in the hands of the people scare them. They are as allergic to them as Dracula is to crucifixes, and for the same reason, they get in the way of tyrannical appetites. We see here today, on this miserable winter day in Olympia, Washington, so seemingly distant from the struggles of the founders in 1775, yet so very eerily close, that the founders were right. Tyranny can be voted in by a majority, as it was with I-594. Tyranny can also come from a duly elected parliament or state legislature. The test for us is, do we submit? No! Or do we resist?
Resist!
Give yourself a hand on that. Will we insist upon our God-given, inalienable, and natural rights as free Americans, or will we submit to tyranny? The answer that has been rediscovered over the past 2 years in places as diverse as Connecticut and Colorado, Texas and Maryland, New York, and yes, right here in Washington State, is armed civil disobedience. Disciplined, determined, well thought out, and precisely executed armed civil disobedience. In all those places, unconstitutional laws have been nullified, rendered null and void as American legal practice has long agreed that they should be, if perhaps not in the way that the justices had it. We engage in armed civil disobedience not to provoke violence, but to prevent it. We are willing to risk being shot for our principles. The question is, what are our alleged leaders willing to risk to satisfy their appetites for our liberty,
The lives of
for our
control.
property, indeed, for our very lives? That's the question that armed civil disobedience seems to focus their attention on. This is not new in American history. From Captain Parker at Lexington Green to the Battle of Athens, Tennessee in 1946, to the Deacons for Defense and Justice during the Civil Rights Movement, armed civil disobedience has been resorted to by the citizenry when all other means of redress failed. What they asked of tyrants in their time, we ask of tyrants in ours. Are your appetites, are your unconstitutional laws worth the taking of our lives to you?
Hell no.
What is your power worth to you? What is your power to order the rest of us about on whatever flimsy pretext you choose? Not in obedience to any rule of law that the founders would understand, not in any constitutional fashion, but what is your power to bend the rest of us to your will worth to you? What are your appetites worth to you? We simply want to be left alone. Okay? I mean, unlike you, we don't seek to compel anyone to do anything. But we will not be compelled ourselves by you. Woo! Yeah. Not just for an appetite, not just for a pretense of legitimacy. And it is a pretense of legitimacy. So we stand here today on our traditional rights as free Americans, as free Washingtonians. We stand where the founders expected us to stand, insisting upon those rights paid for in blood and tears by the generations before us. We stand here, risking all as they did. We stand here insistent as they would have. We stand here disciplined, determined, insistent, refusing to knuckle under the tyranny of any kind, no matter how petty. We stand here today, and I am humbled beyond words for the privilege of standing with you.
Wow.